Whenever I am reading through a cookbook and I see boil for 12 hours, I'm very intrigued. Today's recipe has exactly that. Boil for 12 hours. I was looking for an Indian pudding recipe because this is the time of year for classic New England Indian pudding. There are several different ways to make puddings in the 18th century, and sometimes they bake them, but many times they're boiled. And we've done multiple boiled pudding recipes on the channel. So sometimes we're gonna be boiling like a plum pudding or a hunter's pudding. Rich flour puddings with suet, and they're wonderful puddings. This one is boiled for probably 2 or 3, 4 times longer than a typical boiled pudding. And this isn't huge. Even a big boiled pudding in the 18th century might only get cooked 4 or 6 hours. This one calls for 12 hours. That's crazy. I've got a recipe here from 1798 for a 10-pound, and that's really big, a 10-pound boiled pudding, and it only gets boiled for 6 hours. Now you're saying Indian pudding, what's an Indian pudding? Indian pudding is called Indian pudding because it's made with Indian corn. In the 18th century, what we call corn was always called Indian corn because the word corn just means a grain. It could be any grain whatsoever. So if you said, give me a corn, it might be a corn of wheat, a corn of barley. And in this case, they used the word Indian corn to say, oh, this special grain that today we call corn, or you might even know it by maize, which kind of differentiates it more. So I wanted an Indian pudding, which is what they always called it until maybe about 1840 when it might be called corn pudding. Such a wonderful recipe and so easy that anybody can do it. The recipe today comes from Amelia Simmons's American Cookery, 1796. Very important cookbook for us, understanding what cooking is like in North America in the 18th century. There is no other cookbook like it until 10 and 15 and 20 years later showing up in North America. So this is a sort of a Rosetta Stone cookbook that helps us understand the differences between English cookery from the 18th century, maybe even German cookery where there are influences in here, and what happens when that food comes to North America. There are 3 Indian pudding recipes in this cookbook. We're going to be using number 3, and it goes: salt a pint of meal, wet with 1 quart of milk, sweeten, put into a strong cloth, a brass or bell metal vessel, stone or earthen pot, secure from wet, boil for 12 hours. So super simple recipe. All the materials that we need for this recipe are salt, cornmeal, we need some milk, and we need a sweetener. That's it, like 4 ingredients. It's really simple. Now, she takes a lot of time. She says, we're gonna boil this, and then she gives us like 7 different ways to boil it. So we can boil it in a cloth. We can boil it in a brass pot of some sort. Not sure quite what she's intending here, or a stone or earthenware pot. Now today, we're going to be using an earthenware pot because as the directions go further, it says secure from wet. She doesn't want this to mix with the water that it's getting boiled in at all. And that's very difficult to do if you're boiling in a cloth. So many of the recipes are boiling in a cloth. I thought we would boil in the pot to try it in a slightly different way. This reminds me of something like a jugged hare recipe. There are some recipes where we do this, where we cook inside of a pot that's being boiled all the time. Why are we not baking this? Because some of the recipes are baked. Well, what happens if you don't have an oven? And she's dealing with people that are in all sorts of economic circumstances. Maybe you don't have an oven at home, and that is very true for many people. So something where we get to cook this by boiling it, well, everybody's got a pot to boil something in. We we've got our dry ingredients already mixed up here. And now the important part here is the ratio of cornmeal to milk. We want 1 part cornmeal to 2 part milk by volume. And we've got our 1 part of cornmeal in here. I need 2 cupfuls, and this is like 2 cups here. 2 cupfuls of our milk. And we're gonna add those to this. And it says sweeten to taste, or sweeten it as you please. Many of the recipes as we go into the 19th century further on use molasses. It's a very inexpensive sweetener of the time period. I'm going to use another quintessential sweetener of New England, and that is maple syrup. So sweeten to taste to me means it needs to be kind of sweet. On our maple syrup, I'm using about a cup in this recipe. Like several of the recipes in this cookbook, if you look at this, you say, this will never work. I know I did a pumpkin pie recipe out of the same cookbook, and it made this just totally liquid interior, and I'm thinking, this will never set up. It'll never turn into a pumpkin pie. It turned out perfect. So I'm gonna take her at her word and say, yes, this sloppy mess will make a wonderful Indian pudding. All we have to do now is transfer this into our cooking pot. One last step is to seal this pot up, because I could just put the lid on and then set this in our boiling pot of water, but it says to be really careful that it doesn't get wet inside. So I'm gonna do a couple of extra precautions. I've made this kind of a sealing dough to go in the top level of this. This is something that they would do for the mouths of ovens. If you want the door stopped up really tight to keep the steam in, which is exactly what we want here, you would make a real quick, inexpensive, just you're not going to eat it. It's just to seal up the surface. A little bit of dough. So I just took a little bit of flour, tiny bit of salt in there, and some water, and we made this little dough mixture. Okay, there has got to be a mistake. It does not turn out like this. This is not Indian pudding. And it's basically uncooked down there. This thing cooked for 12 hours. So something's completely wrong with the way the recipe is or the way I read it. So let's dig in. Let's look at that recipe real quick. Sometimes I get a little overexcited and I get working on a recipe and I need to dig a little bit further. So I started digging on this and I found not just one problem, but 2 problems with this particular recipe. And all we really need to do is super dig in on these other ones. Now, because I have done one of these other recipes earlier and it worked out, I thought, it shouldn't be a problem, right? Number one, there are errors on the back side of on the back page of the cookbook. Errors where the author, she says, I didn't know how to lay out this cookbook, so I gave the project to somebody else and they purposely messed up some of my recipes. Anyway, it says here that for Indian pudding number 3, you only boil it 6 hours. Well, we know that overboiling it isn't the problem of this particular part because the bottom just isn't like cooked. So we know that's not the problem. So if we look at recipe number 1, it says, and it doesn't read perfectly, but it says, stir together while hot. Stir together the cornmeal and the milk while it's hot. Well, we didn't do that. It doesn't say that in number 3. And number 2 is even less easy to understand. 3 pints of scalded milk to 1 pint of salted meal, and then let it cool. Again, they're implying that it's hot. You stir those together hot, maybe even kind of cook them together a little bit. And we didn't do anything like that. So I think that's the real problem here, is that the cornmeal needs to be cooked and mixed with that hot milk so that it absorbs some of that moisture before we start to cook it into our pudding. So we're gonna have to try again. Our second try, out of the water bath, and we only cooked it 6 hours this time, so it looks much better. We opened this up, and obviously it stayed almost exactly the same way as it went in, which is probably good. So let's find out just what it ended up tasting like. Now, the one before, we couldn't even serve it like this. It was just so hard and dense, and it just didn't have any flavor to it at all, except for just raw cornmeal, basically. And this has a much nicer texture. Now this is pretty cold. It's been outside, so it's got a really, nice firm texture. Maybe if it was inside, have just a slight bit more flavor, but I don't think this is meant to be eaten hot. Although I think you could eat it hot without any problem, but usually I think they'll let this cool down to room temperature and just serve it up as a dessert. It's a pudding. And it's got a wonderful flavor. Sometimes they put fruit in this one. This recipe did not have any fruit, but you could almost kind of imply from sweetened to your taste that putting raisins in, or currants, or even cranberries were something that they might do in this recipe under the whole sort of category of sweeten. And this has that hint of maple flavor because we used maple syrup. It doesn't have a darker color. If we would have used molasses, it would have sort of a browner color, which sometimes you see with an Indian pudding. Well, this certainly has been a learning lesson in what we see as a recipe sometimes, just a couple lines, super simple, and in fact that makes it much more difficult to interpret and to understand unless we dig into the whole cookbook. In this particular circumstance, we had to pay attention to the errors on the back page, look at all the other recipes, and use them all combined together to understand what this particular recipe is. And if it's a historical recipe like this one, sometimes we even have to go outside of this particular cookbook and say, okay, well, what does it say in another cookbook? Because sometimes each recipe is missing something that the other one has, so that we can truly understand what this dish is supposed to be like. And it helps us if we know what the modern version is too. We can get an idea about, was the earlier one completely different, or are we just not doing it right when we're looking at the historical recipe? I guess the real question is what we achieved with the second part of the cooking. So, we put the cornmeal in the warm milk, and it's started to thicken up, and because the way we prepared this, we kind of cooked it up just a little bit more so that it thickened, and then we put it in here. And tasting the mixture before we put it in here, and then after the 6-hour boil, what was the real big difference? I guess that's a question from your side. It's like, what was the real big difference? And it's really hard to say. With this particular dish that we did this particular time, It doesn't seem like there's a massive difference in the texture, but I do think it possibly took the edge off of some of the corn flavor that some people might not like, or maybe changed the texture so that it didn't have sort of hard bits in it. But it's tough to say that this one changed a whole lot. Was it worth boiling it for 6 hours? I'm just not sure. So I've made a much more successful Indian puddings in the past. This one has been a bit of an experiment on just how this particular version of the recipe worked out. And I think what's really missing here is the little sweet components and the change in texture that you get from raisins or currants or cranberries or even chunks of apples. Some of the recipes mention that. I think it's really missing in here. If I was going to change it, I'd definitely put something in like that. I think it would be much, much better.